I'm Lawrence Francis, host of Interpreting Wine, welcoming you to the New York Winemaker Special series. Across these 8 episodes, recorded in December 2022, we'll be exploring the New York wine scene in the company of 8 different winemakers, covering the Finger Lakes in the first 6 episodes of the series, and Long Island in the last 2. We continue the series in the company of Kelby James Russell of Newt Cellars. We hear his origin story of travel outside of the Finger Lakes and returning home, mentors on the winemaking journey. He gives us an overview of the Finger Lakes winemaking culture, compares the Finger Lakes with the Mosel, talks winemaking style, focusing on his riesling, explores Red Newt's grape sourcing policy, before closing on the UK market. Enjoy.
My name is Kelby Russell. I'm the winemaker at Newt Cellars in the Finger Lakes of New York on the beautiful banana belt of Seneca Lake, for those who are familiar. I got into winemaking at a young age, which is rare in the U.S., but through no less a circuitous path than most people. I think unless you have it in your family history, winemaking isn't something that someone knows they want to get into at a young age. And actually, I was famous in my family. My parents would try and give me like sips of red wine because they always liked red wine with dinner. And I would like be aghast at the suggestion because I wasn't 21 yet. And I guess I was a goody two shoes. But obviously shook that off, got to college. And I went to Harvard, which is not a typical spot for someone from the Finger Lakes to go to. And certainly not a typical spot for someone whose parents didn't go to a 4-year college to go to either. And I thought I was going to go to the big city, leave the Finger Lakes behind, get into initially nanotech, and then eventually shifted around and realized how important the arts were to me. Yeah. And pursued arts management, orchestra management, very, very specific niche, maybe a little more niche even than winemaking. And that was what I thought my career was going to be, like leading the Boston Symphony Orchestra, those sorts of things. And as luck would have it, I ended up in Italy on not really a vacation, more of a fellowship. And it was a stipend. And I decided to spread my money out by exchanging my labor for room and board, and landed at a vineyard. Yeah. And that's where the bug bit me.
Very cool. Very cool. And you also mentioned that I think you worked in orchestra management only during university. And you mentioned that I can't help but pop it in there that you had a stint at the Royal Philharmonic in Liverpool.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. So I kind of, again, there's not really an orchestra management major that usually exists. So I was kind of stitching things together and experiences together to suit that. And one summer, I said, well, I should really do an internship at an orchestra. Like my academic career was all focused on choral singing, like very serious Renaissance groups, and managing those and performing in those. I said, well, I should do orchestra because there aren't many Renaissance choral groups in the world to be manager of. So, and I reached out to a few different spots and heard back from the Royal Philharmonic in Liverpool that they were interested in a free intern, which seemed like a good deal to them. I was 18, so it seemed like a good deal to me, and I moved to Liverpool in summer of, this can make me feel, summer of 2007, and I had a great 2-month stint there. I got very familiar with eating stir-fried greens because the no pay started to rear its head in terms of what that meant. It was also at a time when the pound was really at an absolute peak against the dollar. So it was a particularly rough time to be not well compensated. But I had a great time. I can say that Paul McCartney likes my strawberry shortcake. So that was probably worth the 2 months alone for that story. Like that's the great cocktail story that I get to tell. And I mean, I loved the work as well. I loved the work. I loved the city. I think I'm usually coming to the UK now and working in London, of course, for the wine scene. And when people hear that I have this like long connection to Liverpool. They just look at me like I have three heads. That's just not what they expect someone to come out with. But it was a good time. My joke is that dealing with musicians is only slightly more difficult than dealing with fermentations. So there is some like crossover to what I do in my day-to-day life now. It's just maybe not in the way that most people would expect a winemaker to find their footing.
Yeah, no, I'm sure, and we'll maybe leave your cheesecake story so that you can tell that to the next person that hears this and wants to know more about that. But I'm curious, did the wine, and I guess specifically the experience in Tuscany and the kind of orchestra world, did they sort of come together as well? Because I know that people in the arts do I think have an appreciation of wine and place, and painting those often quite poetic images, and as I think do people in the wine world as well.
Yes, no, I think that's really a fair way to put it. I think the tough thing for me, this was all coming to a head for me my senior year in college, when I was wrestling between the arts management world and the sort of introductions I had there, and what seemed like a very easy career into orchestra management. I was kind of being recruited by different spots, and this like nagging thing in the back of my head that, wow, that wine thing, like that was really a great, like there was something that felt really good about that, and like the physical labor of it and the artistic side of it. So for me, I would say first couple of years, even when I was in wine, I was dealing with, I don't know, it felt like there was a tension between the two because I'd been forced into choosing between them. But as you say, like in reality, there's actually so much connection between them. And I mean, the reason I ended up in wine was because I loved artistic creation. And I know that can be a hotly debated topic, and it depends on the winery or the wine, whether winemaking is an art or a skill or anything like that. But we used to have the same argument over painters, right? Whether it was whether painting was a skill or an artistic form. And I think really it comes down to the person behind the scenes who's what they're trying to achieve through the medium. So for better or worse, I think I've been hopelessly pushed towards the artistic side of winemaking and wanting to express something beautiful that way.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And so I'm already 4 episodes into this particular series, and I just love that everyone is bringing a different answer to that. I guess that story. What do you do, and kind of how did you come to be doing it? And where I think I would like to pick up the story really is that move to the Finger Lakes and just sort of pick up, okay, having chosen the wine route, was it actually then in the Finger Lakes, and I guess kind of coming home, was that the point where you started cutting your teeth, I guess, more in a sort of more structured way, in a more sort of professionalized way than you might have seen over in Tuscany?
Yes, absolutely. Because I mean, Tuscany, as great as it was really just kind of a low level taste of it, and nothing rigorous or formal. Although it was a great exposure to the sort of lifestyle, I suppose. So I came home after university and was still dabbling a little bit in whether I wanted to pursue arts management, but it was also the perfect time, because it was harvest time, to launch into a winemaking career. And like so many people, I think when you grow up somewhere, the last thing you want to do is be there. Usually, I mean, other people have different perspectives on this, but I feel like it's a very typical thing to like want to get away from home.
I hear it a lot.
And when I got home, I said, I was sending out my resume to everywhere except spots in the Finger Lakes initially to see if I could land something. But then the reality of, I have to move someplace for a 6-week job. All those things kind of set in. And I reached out around the Finger Lakes and fortunately heard right back from the owner and winemaker, separately, I should say, from Fox Run Vineyards, just south of Geneva here in the region. And they said, you can come by. Peter Bell was the winemaker, and very self-deprecating. And he was like, oh, yeah, come on by. And I showed up on the time that I thought I was supposed to show up dressed for a job interview, right? I mean, this is the comedy of it. Like, I was in like not quite a suit and tie, but close to it. And Peter Bell, totally somewhat oblivious to this, just handed me a shovel because it was the first day of harvest for them. And it was just like, oh, yeah, you're that guy that, you emailed. Okay, here you go. Like, and I just started shoveling and dealing with grape muck. And I've done this now. I've had tons of people come and want to intern with me, a lot of great people, but a lot of people who don't know what they're getting into, and they do it one day and then, that's fine and that's that. And I think to Peter's surprise, I showed up the next day and the day after that and the day after that. And couldn't get enough of it. I obviously changed my clothing and actually got like actual work clothes. And by the end of harvest, he looked at me and he said, you're good at this. Like, this is, and if you're serious about this, you should do something which at the time, this was 2009, was very uncommon in the Finger Lakes because there wasn't really a young winemaking group in the Finger Lakes at that point. But he made the comment, he's like, if you're serious, you should go to New Zealand and do a harvest there in the off season and start doing 2 harvests a year. Like, that's the way to move your career forward and get more experience. Especially, I mean, at that point, I wasn't really going to consider going back to college, right? It's so much money to do that, to get another degree. And fortunately, the Finger Lakes is a place where you can still get into it by apprenticing. And there are great sort of, mentors to work under and learn from. And that was the route that I ran with.
Amazing. And I think, you've very elegantly kind of brought us onto, what I like to describe as the sort of the culture that surrounds you and ultimately influences what you do and kind of the wines that you make. And I just wonder if you wouldn't mind reflecting on maybe from New Zealand or from some other international experience, maybe talk about some of those mentors, and maybe some specific examples of things that they taught you or things that you learned during that period that, sort of stayed with you to the current day.
Yes. Yeah. I would say New Zealand. So my sort of trajectory, I guess, is a step back. I did 3 years of doing a harvest at Fox Run and then a harvest in the Southern Hemisphere and then back and forth before I landed at Red Newt in 2012 as initially as assistant winemaker and then winemaker. So Peter Bell was my main mentor at Fox Run, this fantastic, very technical winemaker. Very talented winemaker, really one of the key people who pushed the region forward starting in the mid-90s, really professionalized the region. He's a bridge between maybe the sort of like rough and tumble beginnings of the wine region and the sort of professional wines that now exist. And part of the reason he was a bridge is he was such a community believer, right? He hosted tasting groups. He was constantly on the phone because people were calling him with questions about what to do, and he was so generous with his time and his expertise and he was a firm believer that that's what he should do. That's what we should all do. We shouldn't be fighting with one another or competing with one another, which is not the common thing in the wine industry or many industries, I suppose, right? And I think that was Peter Bell. It was also a reflection of the Finger Lakes starting from farmers, right? This is a region that was started by nothing but farmers in the 70s when the grape market crashed and farmers were finally allowed to open wineries. And there is like a farmer mentality here of you help each other out, right? It's like the barn raising sort of thing. So I certainly picked that up from him. New Zealand, I had a good experience in New Zealand, but I had the classic like bulk Sauvignon Blanc experience. So I think it was great to see a big winery. It was good to work on a larger team. It was most important, I think, for me to kind of learn kind of the speed with which you can work in a cellar. My biggest mentor in New Zealand was probably the presses that I was cleaning all the time. And I'm still faster at cleaning presses than anyone else. The year after that, I was in Tasmania, which was a fascinating spot to see. This was kind of when Tasmania was really pushing that they were the next Champagne, and there are beautiful bubbles there, but I think in the decade since, they've shifted a bit more, I would say wisely, to more like Pinot Noir, more still wine. There are beautiful wines coming out of Tassie. that was also an interesting work experience, a smaller team. For better or worse, I learned some lessons about how I wouldn't want to manage people, because where I was not the management style was pretty, I don't know, just kind of like negative. And I really like building people up. So, and then the key experience for me before I started at Red Newt, it was I was night shift red winemaker for Yalumba at their premium site in the Eden Valley. And it's hard for me to sing the praises of that winery. I mean, higher than I could. And in some ways, they're the antithesis of what I do now, right? They did most nights in the red cellar. We did 3 times the amount of fruit that I see in an entire year. And Red Newt is considered a pretty big winery in the Finger Lakes. This is, I'm not working at a postage stamp here. But the winemakers there were so thoughtful and so generous with what they were trying to do. And it was my job to almost be a chameleon. It was a very strange job. It was my job to learn how all 8 of the winemakers wanted their individual ferments to be handled, how they wanted their fruit to be handled, how they wanted their wine to be handled, and to learn what they were trying to accomplish as an individual. And then when they were away at night, it was my job to manage all their ferments, kind of switch disguises and pretend I was, here I'm this person, here I'm that person. This person wants it more reductive. This person wants more stems. It doesn't mean I agreed with all their decisions, but there's no way to learn faster than to have to go through those paces. So, I mean, Louisa Rose was the head winemaker. I think she still might be a real titan of the industry in Australia. She's the one who makes Pusey Vale Riesling as well. And just a brilliant winemaker. Peter Gambetta was the red winemaker I worked with the closest. He's since retired, and I think he's getting a master in fine arts. But he's become such a good friend that he came out to our wedding here in the Finger Lakes and has come and visited us maybe 3 other times just because in the years since. So, that's the best part about wine. Sometimes it's not just the memories. Sometimes you get lifelong friends out of it.
Yeah, amazing. And am I right in saying you're married to another winemaker from the region?
Yes. My spouse is Julia Hoyle. She's the winemaker at Hosmer Winery. Yeah. Everyone always asks if we want to open a winery together, and we could not answer no faster like that. We love each other, and but we both are winemakers, and we both come at it from a creative standpoint. And there's maybe if it was a big winery, right? Like again, the Yalumba example, where you have your own portfolio. But oh my gosh, I can't. But the 2 of us would be at loggerheads if we were actually trying to make winemaking decisions together.
Yeah, brilliant. And, totally unplanned, but I've actually just interviewed Julia a couple of hours ago. So,
oh, wonderful. Yeah.
You're going to be, together at least on the first few episodes of the series. So, make sure that you listen to both of those episodes sort of back to back if you can. I think, the other thing that's come out from what you just said there, from what Julia said, and also, interviewing Ben Riccardi as well earlier this morning is that there is that kind of young energy. There is that people who've traveled, people who've experienced those different type scales, different grapes, and the Aussie culture, which I can totally attest to is different enough from the UK culture. So I'm sure it's nothing like the US, and it's its own thing. And I think bringing all of those different experiences back now, and a bit of a big question, but I guess we've got to ask those big questions. I just wonder, what has maybe through the lens of Red Newt and what your sort of day to day and month to month sort of looks like now. Like how would you sort of characterize I guess how culturally things are fermenting and developing in the Finger Lakes, to give us again, the people that haven't visited, that haven't experienced that, a snapshot of what does it sort of feel like to make wine in that region.
Yeah, I mean it's such an exciting region to be in. I mean, I think that is probably coming across in all the interviews you'll get to do. And it's a region that I think for a long time was considered a backwater, right? Certainly when it was first founded in the 70s and 80s. And then in the 90s and 2000s, you had this sort of like second wave of winemakers, right? This is like the Peter Bell example. And there's many others that really kind of professionalized and like started to hone in on Riesling and Cab Franc and make beautiful examples of it.
And sorry to interrupt, Kelby, might I ask you to actually mention some of those other pioneers? Because we've actually heard the name Peter Bell mentioned a few times. I'm wondering, are there any other?
Oh, sure. Yes, absolutely. So Peter Bell, Dave Whiting, who is the founding winemaker at Red Newt, Morten Hallgren at Ravines, Johannes Reinhardt, who was at Anthony Road and now has his own project, Steve DiFrancesco, retired winemaker for Glenora. I would include someone like Vinny Alaperti, who owns Billsborough Winery now. So a lot of them are still very active. They're not gone with the wind, but they were this generation that came together, I would say, in the 90s and 2000s that really pushed things forward. And they were the ones that really started to get consistent attention for the region in a way that was new. Now, the unfortunate thing is they were doing this with Riesling and cool climate reds during the sort of height of the Parker era, which meant no matter how great those wines were, they were kind of deeply against the tides of the time. And I think the Finger Lake, right, there was always this pressure like, well, why can't the Finger Lakes make a big red like Napa, which is is on its face a silly thing to ask. But people looked down on the region, for a good chunk of time there because we weren't making Napa reds. And this is a U.S., that might be more of a U.S.-based criticism. But so that was that era. Now we're in this, I guess you would say maybe third wave era, where you still have a lot of the legends who are making great wines. But I think the big thing that happened in the last 10 years was the creation of new styles. I think maybe in that second generation era, there was a little bit more of a hegemony of what the correct style of a wine was, what a dry Riesling should be, what a Cabernet Franc should be. And there were certainly house differences. But I think with the young winemakers that are now coming in, you're seeing a real proliferation of expressions and styles within the same grape. And that doesn't mean that you like them all by any means, but I think it's healthier for the region, and it's more exciting for the region to have that spread and that level of creative expression that exists. And again, I mean, like I said, when I started here in 2009, I was back home. The idea of someone going from the Finger Lakes to New Zealand was not revolutionary, but was kind of unheard of. It wasn't a thing that was happening, and now it feels like there's like a slide between the Finger Lakes and the Southern Hemisphere outside of COVID times, because there's so many young winemakers that are excited to be in this region and are cutting their teeth by doing that. So that's been a sea change.
That's it, and I would imagine as well. It's a slide that kind of goes both ways as well, I guess, depending on the time of year, and that actually, do you also have people coming from New Zealand to there and Australia to there? Because
we absolutely do. As the reputation of the region grows, you get more and more interest in that regard. I always joke because of kind of the amount of connections to Australia I've been very keen to bring in Aussie interns to Red Newt. It can be a little bit fraught because they usually end up staying near the winery, which is in a little bit more of a rural area. Which is in the region, and they go out to the local bar, and everyone's very excited to meet an Australian in this small town, and they all think that they can keep up with the ability of an Australian drinker, and it's just a mess for them. Because the next day the intern shows up to work bright-eyed and bushy-tailed at 8 a.m., and my other employees show up looking like they just got dragged through the night and can't even imagine it.
Oh, good memories. Good memories from my own time in Australia as well. It makes me think back, and I was a bit younger, but you still had to get up early and be up with the sun, and even managing to go out for a little run just to help the body.
Open things back up. Yeah,
get its detox in motion. And I'll say again, actually, because I now already 4 interviews deep into this series. I just love the format. I love the medium. I love having guests like yourself on, because every conversation has just been totally different. And I think, they've each given, again, a completely unique, a different view on the region. And it's just, I think that's the power of great content. And, hopefully the listeners are really enjoying this series as we're progressing. One thing I'd draw out actually, and kind of guide the conversation to, and bring us back to the Finger Lakes. And one of the most interesting responses that you provided to the questionnaire that I sent out beforehand was actually talking about people making the connection between the Finger Lakes and the Mosel. I think because of riesling, because of steep slopes, because of slate, and you've put that in there, and you've said, but they're wrong when they make that connection with an exclamation mark. So I'll kind of just leave it there. I'll just invite you to talk a bit to that, because I think that for me is an interesting point, not only in terms of the actual physical geography, I guess, and growing site, but also in terms of the marketing and how people are introduced to Riesling as being the sort of signature grape of the region.
Right. Yeah. And I suppose I'll reveal some of my own winemaking biases in discussing it. So I'll wear those on my sleeve. But I think when I came into winemaking here, the idea of the Finger Lakes as the New World Mosel was maybe the most common thing people reached to. And you can, as you said, you can picture it, right? Like you can stand in the region and kind of imagine why they think that, between Riesling and these slopes that are steep, although we should say they're nowhere near as steep as Mosel slopes. I mean, if anyone's been to the Mosel, I mean, there's a reason they use helicopters to spray now. And, this body of water, and I think there's and the soil, right? I mean, we're shale, they're slate, but they're related for sure. And you can see why people would make that connection. And then I think the winemaking and the grape growing lined up with that. It's almost like that connection was made and people let that lead their winemaking style, right? Mm-hmm. It was this idea that we're supposed to be very bright, very high acid, charming wines, both sweeter styles and drier styles. But my bias in winemaking, and as I got into Riesling, was to really love like Großgewachs styles from Germany and some of the bigger Austrian styles, and wonder, why can't we do that? Why is no one trying to do that in the Finger Lakes? Why is everyone working on this like much tighter, higher acid expression of Riesling, as opposed to maybe like a more, for lack of a better word, a more powerful style, more textural style?
They're still dry, but with a lot more, as I say, maybe slightly more mineral, slightly more sort of challenging, inverted commas, components.
Yes, yeah, and more savory. Yeah, exactly. Uh-huh. And like how does one go about that? 2, is the Finger Lakes right for it? And I think what I'm more struck by now, especially when I look at Seneca Lake, is that Seneca Lake is so big and so deep. I mean, it's wider than the Mosel, obviously, and the Mosel is a river. I mean, it isn't really affecting the microclimate, but Seneca Lake is 200 meters deep, right? I mean, it's a fundamental difference to our climate here. And if you're on those slopes, and we're quite warm actually in the summer. We're a very continental region in some ways, more so than our German colleagues, I would say. Or many than our Mosel colleagues. We have high temperatures. Certainly in the winter, it gets colder. That's a problem as well. But the reality is that we can ripen Riesling more so than maybe we thought we could 15 years ago. which is not to denigrate those wines or that style by any means. And when you're an emerging region, coming up with a style that is, more accepting of early picks is a smart thing to do. It's risk management. It's risky to hang fruit longer and longer into the season, which you need to do to make those big textured styles. And you need the right climate, but you also have to have a bit of risk tolerance, I suppose. So I usually joke that I feel like, Ulysses being like tied to the mast going by the sirens during harvest, because I'll just kind of commit us to this plan of really holding on to the fruit as late as we can. Not for sugar. Like, we're not looking for big alcohol or anything like that. Mm-hmm. It's just the flavor ripeness. And then to get geeky, like the phenolic ripeness of the skins, so that we can make this big textured wine that's still satisfying to drink.
Amazing. And maybe link us to the part of the story where, talk about how has that worked out for you? How has it actually gone in terms of, your wine program and I guess also what you're known for in the market? It's gone well, fortunately, although that wasn't necessarily a given. So I started to pursue this in earnest in 2013. And I know I sometimes feel like this is a bit of like the classic parent-child relationship in a way, right? Like, I was trained my mentor was Peter Bell, who's very like classic technical, very like clean, sleek Rieslings. And sometimes it feels like I'm the teenager that, like, for all the love of those wines, and for Peter, has rebelled and gone the opposite way and is making like these big textural like Rieslings instead. Although we both like each other's wine, so it's not like, I know there's no like slamming of doors and like all those histrionics. But it started for me in 2013 with a wine called the Knoll, which is a single vineyard parcel that I first kind of trialed these ideas on, both out in the vineyard in terms of taking care of it, especially to hang it longer. And then the main thing that I did in the cellar that was very radical at the time, at least for the Finger Lakes, was cold soak, macerate the fruit for a few days before actually pressing it, again, to get as much from the skins, these ripe skins, as possible. Not fermenting on the skins, to clarify, just the passive maceration, kind of like, I don't know, when you cut up strawberries and sprinkle sugar on them. So that was the first crack at it. And it was that first wine was good. I actually left it at like 9 grams per liter sugar because I was worried if I sent it all the way dry, the sort of skin phenolics would come across as astringent or unpleasant. Mm-hmm. I think if I had it to do over again, and you would see it immediately in the following vintage, we started to dry things out because we realized that actually, if the skins are ripe, you don't get an unpleasant phenolic impact from them. It's actually it's a good part of the wine, a good part of the structure of the wine. And I think this, like the Knoll in particular, but then it kind of quickly followed through to our other Rieslings. Our dry Riesling, Tango Oaks Vineyard, is our other single vineyard dry site. This kind of like became the key part of my winemaking style for Riesling, and I would say what I was known for. And those wines, especially the Knoll, became I wouldn't go so far as to say internationally known, but like those are the wines that I'm always asked to show. Those are the wines that have got the big press for us, which is always is hard to predict, but is always nice to have happen. The 15 vintage of my dry Riesling was used by Jancis Robinson to launch her wine glass when she launched that. That was the white wine she picked from around the world to showcase it. So I would say it's safe to say it's gone well for me. I think it in many ways that style has flown me around the world in some ways. And my joke ever since we've kind of like worked on it and honed in on it is that really all I have is like a 5-year head start, right? I like figured out this technique a few years before other people caught on to it, which isn't to say that it's like, I don't know, a magic trick or something like that. But I don't know. I don't want to, it's not like I did anything revolutionary. I just came up with it a little bit ahead of the curve. Yeah, I think it's that I'm sort of thinking back to art as well. We're constantly, I think, being influenced and evolving, and hearing something, seeing something. In your case, tasting something, and I like that. What would it take for me to make something site appropriate that's in that direction without forcing it? How would that express itself if I did X, if I did Y? And I think that's sort of, I think openness to trying new things, I think is certainly an important part of the development of a relatively young wine region. It's I guess the rules, they're kind of there to be broken, but maybe they're a little bit easier to break because they've been in place for less time.
Exactly. Yeah. They're there to be played with. And it's the U.S. You can do anything, right, within reason. Sometimes, we talk to our German colleagues and tell them what we're doing, what we're planting, even, and they look at us like, what? Like, what is?
I love it, and again, super fascinating for me, and again, totally different to the other conversations that I've had, but really, really loving this exploration, really, of that winemaking style, which actually was mentioned in the previous episode, actually, speaking with Bruce Murray. He spoke about having those conversations with you, and I think it's again, something that I'm seeing through these conversations, and it's taken me back to the Willamette Valley, and when I taught there, which I so loved about there, is actually there's a real willingness for you, genuinely, without prompting from me, or I don't think from the foundation, to talk about other wineries, to talk about other wines from the region, to talk about other influences and mentors, because I couldn't agree more with what you said earlier about, your neighbor's not really your competitor. There are now so many things that we can spend our time on, and things we can be drinking. I believe wine's competitor is way beyond that. It's into mezcal, it's into whiskey, it's into gin, it's into non-alcoholic, it's into cider, it's into all of these things that we have our choice. We only have 24 hours in a day. We have a limited amount of money. So I like this idea of collaboration and development, but also doing something a little bit different as well.
Yeah, and I mean, the story of wine is and wines and wineries is so fascinating. I always think about that. I feel like we're starting to come out of, I would call it the seltzer panic, right? We had a few years here in the U.S. where everyone was convinced that hard seltzers were going to destroy like the next generation of wine consumers, and just like the swallows to Capistrano, like the hard seltzer numbers are crashing because in the end, it's people who are going to fall in love with wine and real wine fall in love with it because of the stories and where it takes them. And that's not something that, a super corporate beverage is ever going to do.
Yeah, amazing. And I think as we sort of look towards closing, I'm just aware that there's one area that, I'd ask you to maybe expand on, and that's your viticulture and that idea that you've shared about Red Newt being a hybrid type of winery that doesn't actually own its own vineyards, working with specific sites, and maybe paint a bit of a picture of what the current state is at Red Newt, and maybe what are some of the motivations behind that? What are some of the advantages and maybe even disadvantages of working in that way?
Yeah, so Red Newt was founded as a winery, not as a vineyard and winery, by Dave Whiting, and maintains that, although it has always really prided itself on its fruit sourcing. And at this point, and for a long time, I should say, it's really come down to 4 vineyard sites that we don't own, but that we've helped finance the planting of, that we have a lot of say over what happens in the vineyard, even though there are separate owners for it than from Red Newt. And it's great to give us a real spread of site expression, right? We have sites, 3 of them are on the southeast side of Seneca Lake. One is on the southwest side of Seneca Lake. We get different soil expressions. There's a little bit of diversification. There's some safety there in having different sites in case a hailstorm hits one. And it's really fascinating to see how different growers want to work with their fruit. I think of it back in the context of like being at Yalumba and learning how the different winemakers thought of making wine, but all ultimately made good wine. I think that the vineyards we work with, you see the same thing. We have people who are pristine and like it looks like a golf course. And then we have people who are wild and woolly. And in each case, what matters isn't necessarily that one's better or worse. It's which one does the style fit the vineyard site. And that's a beautiful thing to see. There are challenges with this, of course. And I think maybe the biggest one, just to go back to the winemaking we were talking about, was it's really difficult to convince a grower who's been doing it for decades that you want to change how you harvest the grapes, that you want to hang on them longer on the vine. The grower's like, why would you, what are you asking me to do? Right? Like, this is crazy. Like, you're not even going to gain more sugar. And you say, well, no, it's not the sugar, it's the flavor. And they just look at you like, yeah, but you could harvest them today and they'd be safe. Like, why are we going to fight 2 more weeks out here as the weather turns to winter? And that was initially a challenge. I think the great thing for us is that it shifted us over to acreage contracts with all our growers, which was a new thing in the Finger Lakes. So rather than paying by the ton, they have a guaranteed price that they're going to get for their acreage that they sell to us, which gives them safety, gives us the ability to do what we want, and has allowed us to, I would say, up our sort of game across the board for winemaking, because we it's not just selected parcels that we know we can really take care of now. It's everything we know is being held to the same standard. Yeah, no, I love it. And yeah, I just really invite you in the last question, really, just to talk a bit to the UK market, because I thought that answer was particularly interesting in terms of working with the wine treasury, having success with the classic wines and those top end single vineyard Rieslings, which I guess again are kind of, it's a different way of answering that question about how it's working out for you. But yes, yeah, well, it is, because I think we've been in the UK in various forms for quite a while. Red Newt has, even predating me. And for a while, I think there was an idea that the best way to break into a market is with your least expensive wines, because they're going to be the least painful price point for people to try. Gateway. Yeah, exactly. But the Finger Lakes is not an inexpensive region in the end. I mean, we're actually quite reasonable in some ways, but we can't make oceans of inexpensive wine, right? It's this narrow strip of land around the lakes. It's a tough climate. There isn't, a Kung Fu Girl or a Chateau Saint Michel of the Finger Lakes, nor will there ever be. But in the medium range, what we would call our classic wines, and then especially our single vineyard wines, since we've been importing with the wine treasury, we've discovered that's actually where we're most price competitive, kind of to our surprise. You never think you're going to be most price competitive with your most expensive wines. But I think it's a real feather in our cap that our most expensive Rieslings in particular, which kind of fall into the Gros Gewachs style, are competing stylistically, and people think they are tasting them and finding them to be competitors with Gros Gewachs wines that are usually maybe twice the price of a bottle. And I think that's maybe been the most encouraging thing for us. It feels like a very full circle moment, that this idea that was initially spawned by me trying those wines and thinking, why don't we do that? We now find, and not just Red Newt, but quite a few of us with our top end Rieslings find ourselves being compared 1v1 against those wines, and in a very flattering way as well, I should add. Amazing. And then final thing, if you wouldn't mind just sharing your website and main social media handles where the listeners can go to learn more. Yes. Yeah. So rednewt.com is the main website. The social media handles, for Instagram, it's Red Newt Cellars. I would also say a little bit, Red Newt's Instagram is great and is a little more focused on visiting in person. My Instagram handle is Kelby James Russell, and that is maybe a little bit more of a behind the scenes peek of what's going on in the winery and the vineyard. And usually if you follow my stories, I will go off on rants about dissecting various pop music songs. So you never know what you're going to see.
A huge thanks to Kelby James Russell of Red Newt Cellars. If you enjoyed that episode as much as I did recording it, then do please help to amplify it and the series by sharing the direct link, which is interpretingwine.com/479. You can, of course, find links to all episodes from the series in the description below. Next time on the Interpreting Wine New York Winemaker Special series in episode 480, I'll be speaking with Oscar Binke and Fred Moworth of Herman J. Weimer. Make sure you're subscribed to Interpreting Wine Podcast to be alerted when the episode goes live. See you then.